Getting into Warhammer is an easy decision to romanticize. You'll think about all the models that you're going to build and paint, the epic battles that you're going to wage, and the deep lore that you'll consume and create when you're thinking about your favorite factions and miniatures. But there are two major hurdles that you have to overcome in order to get into Warhammer. The first one is time. You need time to actually build and paint these models. You need time to learn the rules and time to actually play the game, because it does take a few hours to get through just a single game of Warhammer. But an even bigger barrier is money, because Warhammer is not a cheap hobby. I've made a video about how much it costs to get into Warhammer, but today we're going to look at how much it costs to actually buy a complete army that you can play a full-scale Warhammer battle with. So I've gathered some armies. I've got some armies from Age of Sigmar, the medieval, the fantasy version of Warhammer. And I've also got some armies from 40K, the sci-fi, the most popular version of Warhammer. And we're going to take a look at how much it costs to build these armies in both games. And these army lists are from tournaments that I've kind of found online. So people post results, they post the lists. And so if your army list is in here, that's pretty cool. But basically, these are all lists that either won or placed in a major tournament with a lot of different players. So they'd be considered competitive, at least at the time of filming for this video. So that gives us a little bit of insight into if you want to buy the good stuff, you want to compete, which is, not at all necessarily what I'd recommend. It's the rule of cool. You get what you want to play with, what you want to paint, and what you want to build. But let's say you were to put together a list, a 2,000 point list for either game, what would that actually cost you? So we're starting here with Nighthaunt, which is one of the best factions in Age of Sigmar. And you can see that there are a lot of green price tags here for these different models that we have. The very first one, though, is the manifestation lore, which is morbid conjuration. Now, this is a general thing that once you buy it, you have it for all of your armies. So it's not a huge deal if you get it once and then get to use it for all these different types of armies, but also you don't have to use it at all, especially if you're starting out. So this one's kind of like, maybe you buy this, maybe you don't. Everything else, though, that's on this list is something that you're going to need. So we have a big general here model. This is a 300 point model. It costs $67.50. By the way, we're talking about Canadian. We've got a bunch of different infantry models here and various other types that are ranging from about, $70 each to, $67.50. Some of them are reinforced, which means if they're reinforced, you've bought 2 boxes of them. And so this army, when it all comes down to it, we can see at the bottom here, costs about $734 to $834, depending if you bought the morbid conjuration Canadian, right? And if you're wondering, my American friends, what that would cost you, well, it's going to be like $500 to $600 for a complete army. Now, hold on. That doesn't actually factor in any of the paints, the building supplies, the things that you need to put these together. And so for Canadian people, it's probably going to run you at the end of the day over $1,000 to build this army from scratch when you don't have, anything at all. And there are bundle boxes with, discounts on minis. They don't really help this army out that much. We also have to think about the rules for your army, because some of them are online and you can use them for free, but depending on when you're watching this video, there might be a battletome, and that battletome is going to be essential to how you actually play your faction, and a battletome is going to run you about another $70. So you can see how when we have the army list here, we have all the paints and the supplies that we're going to need, and then you put a battletome on top of that. We're talking about over $1,000 Canadian to play an army. The second one that I have here is the Gloomspite Gits, and you can see there's a general trend here of how much these boxes cost. They're going to be about $75 each or somewhere in that range, and some of the smaller models or like lower model counts will be closer to $50 or $40, but still at the bottom here, the total cost is $987. That's not including paint, that's not including a battletome or any of those other costs that might be associated with getting an army. If you're American, $700 for the same army. We also have a Skaven army, which is a horde army, lots of little guys, although this one doesn't have a ton of them. But this one does have faction terrain. It has a gnaw hole down at the bottom. That's another $75 that doesn't count towards your point total. It also has a manifestation lore, which we talked about. If you buy that manifestation lore, you're spending a little bit of extra money. And at the end of the day, this army costs $827.50 Canadian, or just about $600 American. So still quite expensive to get in. Once you have an army, you can play with it for a very, very long time. That time invested in the painting, in the building, and in the playing tends, if you like the game, tends to be worth it. It's more value out of your dollar than you're actually going to get from a lot of other hobbies. But when you look at it all at once, yeah, it's going to be a big financial investment. We can also look at some 40K armies because they are quite expensive. They're actually way more expensive than a Age of Sigmar army. And a big reason for that is that the point total for every single little model in 40K is smaller than in Age of Sigmar. It means that to get to the same 2,000 point limit that they have for both games, you have to buy more 40K to do it than you do have if you have to do Age of Sigmar. So what that means for something like Astra Militarum, and again, that is like a kind of like closer to a horde army as far as I'm aware, that the regular humans, they're not elite. You have to buy a lot of models. And you can see that there's a ton of $50 models, a ton of $80 models. And these ones here, the reinforced like Death Corps of Krieg, I only saw them, kind of these like elite kits that were 10 models per. So 20 would be, $216. I don't know if there's a cheaper way to do that. But when you look at the total, it's at $1,871.50 Canadian or $1,300 American. Really, really expensive compared to Age of Sigmar, where we just saw was like $900 or was like kind of the cap before, your paints and your battletomes and stuff. So same thing goes for 40K. Yes, there are online rules that you can use, but if you're looking to get those hard cover rules, then it's going to cost you a little bit more. We can look at an orc army. So this orc army has a bunch of $50 kits. That seems pretty good. There's some $70 ones or whatever. But when we get down to the very bottom, because you can just see the clear, like the sheer number of kits that they have, you still are getting up to $1,412.50 Canadian, or about $1,000 American. So these 40K armies a little bit more expensive. But hold on now. What if we go and we look at like an elite army that doesn't have so many freaking kits? How much is that going to run you? Well, we could look at a demon-based army, but the problem there is that when you buy all of these big demons that take up most of your points, they cost a lot of money as well. So Bellicor, $200. Great Unclean One, $200. Keeper of Secrets, $200 Canadian. Lord of Change, $200. And then some cheap $50 kits to round it out, and a $94 Soul Grinder. Actually, two of them. Let's make it. And so the total for this army is actually $1,200.39 Canadian, or just under $900 American. So what we're figuring out here is you're going to spend a lot of money buying these models. And that's okay, because you're into it, presumably, but this is going to help you make that decision. And the other thing you have to think about is that you really, really, really should not be doing this all at once. This is something that might happen over the course of a year, 2 years, 3 years. It's going to be something that you buy a little bit, you build it, you paint it, you work on it, and you slowly build your way up. You play points games that are less than 2,000 points. You play with 500 points, 1,000 points, whatever it is. You don't rush it. Now, I know all of us don't operate in that way. People have different levels of disposable income, but I strongly urge you not to go straight to this, especially if you haven't played a game yet, because it's going to be easier to learn games at smaller point totals anyway. Now, there are some other options depending on if you want to save money or look into some other ways of getting some models. Now, of course, there's proxies. You can use models to stand in for a different model that you don't have. You can actually, just get the base and make some sort of note system if you want to test something with your friend. You can buy other games models and use those instead, or 3D print models to use instead. Now, if you go to an official tournament or a Games Workshop store, you can't use any of that stuff. But if you're playing with your friends, there's no problem with that. You can also explore the box sets that I was talking about. Now, a lot of times the box sets don't necessarily line up with the competitive lists, which again, I don't think is a problem, but it is if that's what you're into. But you can also look at things like used models. So if you still really want those Games Workshop models, you want to be included on, you know, those official tournaments and go to a Games Workshop store and play there, because maybe it's like my local Games Workshop where they run some really cool events and the people are there are super nice. Like, yeah, you want to go out there and play with those people and those employees. Well, then you can go ahead and look into something like used models. So I'm on Facebook Marketplace here, and we can see that there's cheaper prices already. Now, we're not talking about necessarily 2K points. Some of these do specify, like down here at the bottom, it says 2,000 points of Imperial Fists for $500. That's like going to be almost a $1,000 discount on what we were looking at before. If this is really 2,000 points, you know, when this post was made, was that still like the same point values? Maybe they've changed. I don't know. Like up here, the painted Necron, I believe that one specifies that it's 1,000 points. So, you know, you're getting halfway there for $500. Still a good deal. You can get right into it. There's no painting, no building needed in that case. For some people, that's a demerit. For some people, that's a plus. You can also look at eBay. And when we look at eBay, there are some really big lots here. So for example, there's a full Death Guard army, and it's pretty sizable at $600. That's a good deal. It is. There's an entire Gene Stealer Cult tournament army, and it's a bid right now for $246, which seems crazy, but there's already 5 bids on it, so it's probably going to go up. And there's lots of big lots of models that if you were looking into just picking up some guys so you can actually get and play, like, you know, get a game going anytime relatively soon, then this is the type of thing that you might look into. But if you're like me, then you know what, you're going to want to spend the time to actually build and paint and work on these models, because that's half the fun. And when you read the lore and you get into that side of it, it builds up your anticipation of actually playing games or of using certain models or certain units, because you've read about them in the lore. All of a sudden they're way cooler than they were in just like a page description when you looked at the Games Workshop site, and you get even more hyped for things. I think that's the best way to get into it, but everybody has different preferences. So that's it. That's how much it costs to actually play a full scale 2,000 points game of Warhammer. If you're Canadian, it's going to be well over $1,000 to get every single piece that you need assembled, ready to go, rules, painted, etc. If you're American, it's going to be close to $1,000 as well, depending on which game you're playing, but less than $1,000 if you're playing Age of Sigmar. So it is a sizable investment, but you also have to think about what time period that's happening over, because if you spend that much in a year, I think that's actually a very reasonable price considering how much you might spend playing, you know, I don't know, another game that has a subscription model, you know, where you're buying cash shop stuff. If you're looking at a yoga subscription, gym subscription, maybe you're playing men's league soccer. I don't know. I'm just thinking of some of the things that I've done in the past where those costs actually go up quite a bit when you add up every single piece of it. Again, we're not talking about like 1 month. We're not talking about, you know, just like a startup fee for something. We're talking about all the costs that come into it at the end of the day that you have to account for. And if you're not looking at that type of budgeting, then yes, this just looks really scary on face value, but that's part of why I made the video, so we could actually talk about those things, see the prices, and make some decisions. So let me know what you think. Has this scared you off playing Warhammer? Are you just, you know, now really excited because you can see an endpoint? Well, you know, that's not true. There is no endpoint, because then you get your second army. Either way, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you all again in another video.